Farming was a practice where West African children were privately fostered by white families. West African parents would pay these families to look after their children temporarily throughout the latter half of the 20th century. About 70,000 children of Nigerian origin, although some were Ghanaian, were affected by this private system that was kept secret for so long until a few years ago. From the 1950s onwards, many Nigerians and some Ghanaians came to the UK as students, mostly male. In 1955, the Colonial Office decided that married overseas students staying over 9 months in the UK could bring their wives to Britain, not just to prevent interracial marriage, but for their wives to also offer a useful link to home for the students. West African couples would have children in Britain. This created problems for the parents themselves because their stay was temporary in addition to their children, and they needed time for studying. It was this when many West Africans turned to farming. Farming is not a new concept. Another term for farming is baby farming, and it stems from the late Victorian era. Women who farmed their children were often working class and found themselves dealing with pregnancies and children they could not care for financially. Some women placed their child in custody of a paid caregiver if they could afford it, but most of these women looked for cheaper options. The most common option was the fostering of children in the countryside, which was more desirable than being raised in the urban areas, because back then the streets were filled with diseases, substance abuse and prostitution. Mothers of these children preferred to work in the city because of the better opportunities and higher wages. Advertisements looking for children or newborn babies to foster appeared in the mid-19th century. It was mainly female nurses who demanded money to look after them. Some nurses demanded weekly payments to feed and clothe the children, while other nurses asked for a huge lump sum payment. The word adoption was usually referred to this. Adoption was not yet regulated at the time. Some nurses really did care for the children, while other nurses saw this as a way to make a good profit through the system. Unfortunately, a few of the nurses turned into child murderers, such as Amelia Dyer, a widow trained as a nurse who killed up to 400 children, although she was hanged for the murder of only one child. She remains one of the most notorious serial killers of the 19th century. Moving on to the 20th century, advertisements were placed by mostly Nigerians looking for their children or babies to be fostered. In 1955, the first advertisement was placed by a Nigerian family in the magazine Nursery World. In the 1974 edition, there was an advertisement placed in it which read, "Pretty baby girl needs a new home," placed by a Nigerian mother looking for her 3-month baby to be cared for. Because there was great demand, the magazine introduced a Homes Wanted section. Between 1967 and 1970, 6,700 adverts were placed by West African parents. In 1968, the Times reported that 5,000 West African children were being privately fostered each year. In addition to the parents being students, they also had jobs. Fostering was not yet regulated, so placing a child under the care of others without informing the authorities was legal. The experiences of farming children were mixed. Some were mostly positive and some were mainly negative. Many children, though, had problems with racism and their own identity. In the most extreme cases that were widely publicized, 18 African children died in foster homes between 1961 and 1964. Interviews have been recorded in the last few years of those who were farmed. For example, Kemi Martins, who was fostered from the early 1970s when she was a baby, had an overall positive experience being looked after by her white foster parents. She stated that as a foster child, she was treated the same as her foster parents' biological children. She lived in Canvey Island, a seaside town of Essex. Martin said, "They treated us as though we were their own kids. There was no element of, you're the foster kids, you get second best." Toyin Okunuga, a business analyst and inspirational speaker, was fostered from 2 months old up until 8 years old. Her father studied electrical engineering, whilst her mother was on a secretarial course. Okunuga was looked after by a white family in the village of Letby, Leicestershire. Despite being the only black person in the village, she said she did not experience racism and was very upset when her fostering experience ended, describing it as one of the most traumatic times of my life. However, she did criticize the lack of regulation in fostering. Fostering is now regulated, even if it is private. Florence Olejide, author and former head teacher, recalled having warm memories of her second foster family. She was fostered for a short time as a baby before being fostered by the second. But there were incidents of racism that she encountered. One time, she was called a racial slur by a friend during an argument. She asked her foster parents, "Why am I black? Why am I the only black person for miles?" She also remembers asking if she had scrubbed her skin, would she be white underneath? Her experience ended abruptly because her parents were worried about the rise of cases where fostering families were winning custody after biological parents wanted to move back to Africa. Florence and her parents moved to Nigeria in the middle of the country's civil war. You can read more about Florence's story in her memoir, Coconut, and Toyin's book, Hush to Roar. The links of these books are in the description. Filmmaker Adewale Akinyowe Agbaje directed Farming, a film about the process based on his own experiences of being farmed out. He was raised by a white working-class family in Tilbury, Essex in the 1980s. He had an identity crisis and hated his own skin colour, so much that he joined a white skinhead gang in the early 1980s as a teenager. The members had previously physically and psychologically tormented him, but now he was being used to provoke fights with rival gangs. Farming was released in 2018, where the main character Enitan is played by Damson Idris. Kate Beckinsale and Gugu Mbatha Raw also star in this autobiographical feature. I've watched this film and I highly recommend it. Some black celebrities in Britain were also targeted by the system, including the singer Seal, Chris Akabusi, ex-footballer brothers Justin Fashanu and the late John Fashanu, Gina Yashir, film director Shola Amu, and young footballer Nelson Abbey. A TV documentary program called White Nanny, Black Child was aired back in 2023, which explored the story of farming. You can watch it on the Channel 5 Catch-Up website. Link is on the description. You can use a VPN if the website is not available in your country. In the meantime, thank you for watching this video and I hope you enjoyed it.